The silence that didn't match the rope. They said it was suicide. That word moved through Harlem like a cold wind, quick, careless, and final. People repeated it the way people repeat weather forecasts, not because they believed it, but because it was easier than asking questions that could get them hurt. By the time the sun climbed high enough to wash the brownstones in pale gold, the story had already settled into place. A woman found dead, a rope, a closed case, nothing to see. But silence has a sound when it lies. Her name was Eliza May Carter, and she had been known in the neighborhood for walking with her head high and her voice low. She worked long days at a dress shop near Lenox Avenue, stitching seams for women who never learned her name, and at night she went home to a narrow apartment where the walls carried every sound. She was not the kind of woman who vanished into despair quietly. She argued when she was wronged, she laughed loudly when she was happy, and when she was afraid, she told people. That morning, nearly 400 people stood behind the thin rope held by the police. Shopkeepers leaned in doorways. Men in pressed coats pretended not to stare. Women clutched their purses too tightly. Everyone was watching, but no one was speaking, except Bumpy Johnson. He didn't arrive with noise or threats, no convoy, no raised voices. He walked like a man who belonged to the street because the street had shaped him. His coat hung heavy on his shoulders, his hat pulled low, eyes sharp but controlled. People made space without realizing they were doing it, not out of fear alone, but because when Bumpy stopped walking, things tended to change. The police were already done. Reports written, cars listed, the rope had been cut, the body moved, the room secured, efficiency masquerading as closure. Bumpy didn't say a word at first. He stepped forward slowly, past the murmuring crowd, past the uniformed men who stiffened but didn't stop him. There was something in his presence that made confrontation feel unnecessary, like arguing with gravity. The body lay still, covered now, dignity restored in the way officials believed dignity worked. Bumpy looked at her face for a long moment, not with hunger for answers, but with respect. Then his eyes dropped, and he reached out, just once. His fingers touched her neck. The crowd leaned in as one. Bumpy didn't flinch. He didn't dramatize it. He simply pressed his thumb gently, the way a man might check the pulse of someone he hoped wasn't gone. Then he lifted his hand and said, quietly but clearly enough for everyone nearby to hear, "This wasn't suicide." The police officer nearest him scoffed. "Sir, we—" Bumpy raised his hand, not in threat, but in finality. He turned slightly, angling her neck toward the morning light. That's when they saw it. Not one mark, two, parallel, burned deep into the skin. Rope burns, but not the kind made by gravity. These were uneven, jagged, pressed from the side. 400 people saw it, and none of them forgot. A woman near the front gasped and covered her mouth. A man cursed under his breath. Someone else whispered, "That ain't right." The sound moved through the crowd like a ripple across water, small at first, then unstoppable. The officer swallowed. Bumpy straightened slowly. "You hang yourself," he said calmly. "The rope tells the truth. This rope is lying." No one argued, because ropes don't lie unless someone makes them. The neighborhood had known fear for years, but this was different. This wasn't fear of gangs or money or power. This was the fear of knowing the truth had almost been buried in daylight. Bumpy stepped back, giving the body space again. He didn't need to. What needed to be seen had already been seen. As the crowd began to break, whispers turned into conversations. Names were mentioned, old grudges remembered. Things that had been ignored suddenly demanded attention. Harlem had a memory, and it had just been awakened. Later that day, in a quiet back room where the walls had heard confessions and promises alike, Bumpy sat alone. He removed his hat and rested it on the table. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he spoke, not to the room, but to the truth itself.
They thought no one would look close, he said softly. They thought nobody would care enough to touch the truth. He leaned back, eyes hard now, not with anger, but with resolve. Eliza May Carter didn't die alone, and she won't be forgotten. Outside, Harlem kept moving. Children played, trains rattled. Life pretended it hadn't just shifted. But under the surface, something had cracked open. Because when 400 people see the same truth at the same time, lies don't survive very long. And this was only the beginning.
When fear learned the truth was watching. By nightfall, Harlem no longer whispered about Eliza May Carter. It breathed her name like a warning. Windows stayed lit longer than usual, and doors closed softer, as if sound itself could betray intent. The official story still stood on paper, but paper had lost its power once the truth had been seen with bare eyes. 400 witnesses carried that image home with them, and each carried it differently, some with anger, some with dread, some with the terrible burden of knowing that staying silent now meant becoming complicit. Bumpy Johnson understood that fear well. He had lived with it, negotiated with it, and learned how to make it blink first. He also knew that truth, once revealed, didn't move on its own. Someone had to carry it forward, and that someone would have to be willing to stand in the open long enough for others to step out of the shadows. The next morning, Harlem woke to something unfamiliar, hesitation among those who believed themselves untouchable. Men who usually walked with swagger checked over their shoulders. Conversations stopped when strangers entered rooms. Bumpy moved quietly, not because he was hiding, but because silence unsettled people more than threats ever could. He began where he always did, not with force, but with memory. He visited people who had known Eliza, not interrogating them, not demanding answers, but reminding them who she had been. He spoke of how she stayed late at the shop to finish work she wasn't paid for, how she once stood between a child and a beating without thinking twice, how she had said weeks before her death that someone was watching her wrong. Those words mattered now. Context gave shape to fear, and fear, once shaped, could be challenged. Witnesses didn't come forward all at once. At first, they came indirectly. A cousin told a friend. A shopkeeper hinted at a late-night argument overheard through thin walls. A neighbor mentioned footsteps on the stairs at an hour when decent people slept. Each fragment alone meant nothing, but Bumpy collected them like pieces of a broken mirror, careful not to cut himself on the edges. He didn't write anything down. He didn't have to. Harlem had taught him that information lived best when it stayed alive in people, moving quietly, changing hands without leaving a trail. Still, the resistance was real. Some doors stayed shut. Some eyes refused to meet his. Fear had roots here, deep ones, watered for years by consequences that came swiftly and without mercy. The pressure came next, subtle at first, then undeniable. Police cars lingered where they didn't belong. Men who weren't from the neighborhood suddenly knew everyone's name. Rumors spread that Bumpy was stirring trouble, that reopening old wounds would only bring more pain. That was always the argument used to protect lies, peace over truth, quiet over justice. Bumpy rejected it without saying so aloud. He knew that a peace built on fear was just silence waiting to break. When someone finally spoke openly, a woman whose hands shook so badly she had to sit down mid-sentence, the room fell still. She didn't describe violence. She didn't need to. She described hearing Eliza's voice change from defiant to controlled, the way someone sounds when they realize resistance will cost too much. She described a man telling her to be smart, and another saying, "No one will question this." Those words landed heavier than any confession, because they explained the confidence behind the lie. Bumpy listened without interruption.
He didn't reassure her with promises he couldn't guarantee. Instead, he gave her something stronger: acknowledgement. He told her she wasn't weak for surviving, that fear didn't invalidate truth, and that silence forced by threat wasn't the same as silence chosen. That distinction mattered. It allowed people to forgive themselves long enough to stand up. As more stories aligned, a pattern emerged, not of chaos, but of planning. Eliza hadn't been killed in anger. She had been silenced deliberately. Someone had decided she was inconvenient, and someone else believed the neighborhood would accept the explanation without question. That was the mistake. Harlem could live with many things, but not with being insulted by a lazy lie. By the end of the second day, Bumpy no longer needed to knock. People came to him, quietly, carefully, often late at night, faces half hidden by shadows. Each carried the same question in different words: what happens if I talk? Bumpy never answered it the same way twice. Sometimes he said nothing and let them reach their own conclusion. Sometimes he told them the truth, that there were no guarantees, only choices. And sometimes he reminded them that Eliza had already paid the price for everyone's fear, and that asking her to carry it alone, even in death, was another kind of violence. That was when people nodded, wiped their eyes, and spoke. The city authorities began to sense the shift. Reports were questioned, timelines re-examined. The rope, once discarded as irrelevant, became evidence again. Pressure mounted not because of threats, but because too many people were now saying the same thing in different ways. Consistency frightened liars more than outrage ever could. Bumpy stayed in the background as much as possible, knowing that the moment this became about him, the truth would lose its center. This was Eliza's story, and he intended to keep it that way. Still, everyone knew who started the movement, simply by touching the truth when others refused to look. As night fell on the second day, Harlem felt heavier but clearer, like the air before a storm that everyone knows must come. Fear was still present, but it had changed shape. It no longer paralyzed, it sharpened. People understood now that the lie was bold because it assumed indifference, and that assumption had failed. Eliza May Carter was no longer a quiet name attached to a closed case. She had become a mirror, forcing a community to see what happened when injustice was allowed to wear the mask of convenience. And somewhere in that growing awareness, something irreversible had begun, something that would demand answers no matter how uncomfortable they became. What no one knew yet, not the police, not the men who had ordered the silence, not even most of Harlem, was that the next step would force a choice that couldn't be undone. Because once truth gathers enough witnesses, it doesn't ask permission to move forward. It simply does.
When the lie began to defend itself. By the third day, the lie stopped pretending it was invisible. It began to defend itself, and that was how everyone knew it was weakening. Official voices grew louder, more certain, repeating the same conclusions with an urgency that betrayed them. Statements were issued, then reissued with slightly different wording, as if rearranging sentences could repair what 400 pairs of eyes had already confirmed. Harlem noticed the shift immediately. When power rushes to reassure, it is rarely doing so for the comfort of the people. It is protecting itself. Bumpy Johnson watched this unfold with the patience of a man who had learned that desperation reveals more than confidence ever does. He understood that the truth had reached a dangerous stage, not yet victorious, but too visible to be erased quietly. This was the moment when mistakes were made by those who believed they were still in control. The pressure turned personal. Men who had never cared about Bumpy's movements suddenly knew where he had been and when. Friendly warnings arrived disguised as concern, suggesting that he was risking unnecessary trouble, that reopening the matter would only bring harm to people who had already suffered enough.
The language was careful, polished, and cowardly, crafted to sound reasonable while avoiding responsibility. Bumpy heard it all without reaction. He had lived long enough to recognize fear dressed up as authority. What concerned him more was the community itself, because truth does not only threaten those who lie, it also frightens those who have learned to survive by staying neutral. Some supporters grew quiet. Others hesitated, wondering whether stepping back now might still be possible. Bumpy did not blame them. He knew the cost of courage and never pretended it was cheap. Behind closed doors, the story began to crack. Timelines failed to align. Witnesses who had been dismissed as unreliable suddenly matched each other too precisely to ignore. The rope burns, once brushed aside, became the central problem. No amount of explanation could turn them into an accident without insulting basic human understanding. Experts were consulted quietly, their conclusions softened before being recorded, but even softened truth carries weight. The more the lie was examined, the more effort it required to sustain it, and that effort left fingerprints everywhere. Bumpy didn't rush this phase. He allowed the system to exhaust itself, trying to maintain an illusion that was no longer plausible. Every delay, every contradiction, every attempt to redirect attention only made the eventual reckoning more severe. Then came the intimidation, not loud or obvious, but surgical. Jobs became uncertain, leases were questioned, small inconveniences piled up around people who had spoken, each one plausible on its own, devastating in combination. Fear returned, sharper than before, and some wondered whether they had misjudged the cost of telling the truth. Bumpy addressed this not with speeches, but with presence. He showed up. He sat with people. He reminded them that intimidation was not a sign of strength, but of panic. He told them that power never lashes out unless it feels cornered. And most importantly, he made sure no one felt alone. Isolation is the most effective weapon against truth, and Bumpy refused to let it take root. The city could no longer pretend this was a simple matter. Public confidence wavered. Quiet conversations among officials grew tense. Someone would have to take responsibility, and everyone was calculating how far the damage might spread. Bumpy knew that accountability, when delayed too long, often seeks the smallest possible target, a scapegoat, a procedural error, a convenient explanation that absorbs blame without exposing intent. That possibility angered him more than the original lie. Eliza May Carter had not died so that someone else could wear the consequences meant for those truly responsible. Justice, if it was going to mean anything, had to be precise. It had to name what happened without euphemism, without shortcuts, without comfort for comfort. As the pressure peaked, a moment arrived that changed everything, though few recognized it at first. A single official decision meant to quiet unrest, instead acknowledged doubt. Just a sentence, carefully worded, but it mattered. Once doubt was admitted, certainty could no longer be enforced. That opening allowed the truth to breathe, and once it did, it expanded rapidly. Harlem felt it before it saw it. The air shifted. Conversations grew bolder. People stopped whispering Eliza's name and began speaking it aloud. Memory became an act of defiance. The woman who had been reduced to a case number reclaimed her identity through collective insistence. Bumpy stood apart from the growing momentum, aware that the most dangerous moment was still ahead. Truth exposed is powerful, but truth acted upon is disruptive. Someone would resist that disruption. Someone would decide that the cost of accountability was higher than the risk of escalation. He prepared for that without dramatics, without threats, simply by staying steady. He reminded himself that justice was not about spectacle, it was about alignment between what happened, what was known, and what would be done next. Anything less would be another form of betrayal.
When the truth refused to leave. The final stage did not arrive with sirens or public declarations. It arrived quietly, the way inevitability often does. By the time officials were forced to act, the decision had already been made for them by the weight of accumulated truth. Too many people knew, too many accounts aligned, too many contradictions had been documented, whispered, and remembered. The city's attempt to manage the situation, rather than confront it, had failed, and now the choice was no longer between exposure and concealment, but between controlled accountability and irreversible collapse of trust. Bumpy Johnson recognized this moment instantly. He had seen it before in different forms, when powerful men delayed too long and discovered that patience could turn into pressure, and pressure into inevitability. The lie surrounding Eliza May Carter had survived on confidence and indifference, but both had been stripped away, leaving it fragile and exposed. The confrontation, when it finally came, was not dramatic in the way stories often imagine justice to be. There was no shouting, no grand confession, no sudden reversal that satisfied every wound. Instead, there was a slow, undeniable unraveling. Reports were reopened, testimonies were reclassified, language shifted from certainty to inquiry, from finality to responsibility. The rope burns, once dismissed, now stood at the center of every discussion, impossible to ignore without openly insulting the intelligence of the public. The officials involved began distancing themselves from decisions they had once defended, each one carefully stepping backward, hoping the shadow of blame would fall elsewhere. But shadows do not disappear simply because people move. They stretch, they follow, and they reveal the shape of what caused them. For Harlem, the outcome was not defined solely by legal procedure, but by recognition. Eliza May Carter's death was no longer a closed narrative imposed from above. It had become a shared truth, acknowledged in the open, spoken without fear, remembered without shame. That mattered more than any single consequence, because it restored something deeper than justice. It restored dignity. Bumpy understood this better than anyone. He knew that systems could punish individuals, but only communities could reclaim meaning. By refusing to let Eliza be reduced to an explanation that did not fit her life or her injuries, Harlem had rejected the idea that some lives were easier to dismiss than others. That rejection changed people. It stayed with them in how they spoke, how they questioned, how they refused to accept convenience as truth ever again. Bumpy did not celebrate. He did not claim victory. When asked later why he had involved himself, he offered no speeches, no philosophy. Those close to him knew the answer without asking. He had touched her neck, not as an act of defiance, but as an act of recognition. In that single gesture, he had acknowledged her humanity in a moment when it was being erased. Everything that followed flowed from that acknowledgement. The witnesses, the pressure, the unraveling of the lie, all of it began when someone cared enough to look closely and refused to look away. Bumpy believed that power, when separated from responsibility, always reveals its weakness eventually, and that truth, when given space, does not need force to prevail. As time passed, the story of Eliza May Carter did not fade into rumor or legend. It became a reference point, a quiet standard against which future explanations were measured. When officials spoke too quickly, people remembered the rope burns. When conclusions felt too convenient, people remembered the silence that did not match the story. The lesson endured not because it was dramatic, but because it was human. A woman had been dismissed, a community had refused to accept it, and a man had proven that sometimes the most powerful action is simply touching the truth before it is buried. In the end, what remained was not anger, but resolve. Harlem carried forward a deeper understanding of its own voice and its own worth.
Bumpy returned to the rhythm of his life, changed but unburdened, knowing that justice does not always arrive cleanly, but it leaves behind clarity when it comes honestly. Eliza May Carter was no longer defined by the lie told about her death. She was defined by the truth that survived it. And that truth, once seen by 400 people and held by many more, refused to disappear again. The city moved on, as cities always do, but something permanent had shifted beneath its motion, because there are moments when a single lie is exposed so completely that it teaches an entire community to see. And once people learn to see, they do not return easily to darkness.